Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, September 1st of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is September 6th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, it's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're studying the Gospel Lectionary this week, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information on what the leadoff person would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sarah Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton, and Bill Hull is our leadoff for today, and we can't wait to see what he has in store for us. Hello, my friend.
Good morning, and good morning to my team members, Sarah, Charles, Don, and also welcome to those of you listening or viewing at a later time. We're grateful that you're a part of this conversation. A quick little bit of background and then the scripture reading. Last week, we dealt with the portion of Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus, we are told, began to tell his disciples that he had to suffer and die. Peter challenges him. Jesus confronts, rebukes Peter, that get thee behind me, Satan. And the lectionary skips Transfiguration. I should skip it at this point. It comes up during Lent, but for now on our journey, we omit the Transfiguration. And also in chapter 18, which we're going to read from in a moment, it omits the conversation about who is the greatest. Jesus uses a child as an example, tells the parable of the lost sheep, the 99 and 1, and then we have today's passage followed by what we will look at next week, Peter's question, how many times are we to forgive? And so now we come to Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20. And this morning I'm going to read from a different translation. Frederick Dale Bruner has an excellent 2-volume commentary on Matthew, and he offers his own translation. And interestingly, the title that he gives to this section that I'm about to read is The Love That Confronts Others. It's dealing with the issue of how Christians confront each other. So, reading from Bruner's translation, let us listen to this portion of God's Word. Now, if your Christian brother or sister sins, go confront that person privately, just the two of you. If he or she listens to you, you have won that one back into the family. But if there is no listening to you, take one or two others so that, as Scripture says, quote, by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every charge may be sustained, end quote. But if he or she ignores them, tell it to the church. But if there is even an ignoring of the church, let that person be to you like a pagan or a tax collector. Amen, I tell you, whatever you disciples bind here on earth will have been bound in heaven. And whatever you disciples loose here on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Again, amen, I say to you, if even 2 of you here on earth pray in agreement about any matter, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. You see, wherever 2 or 3 people gather together in devotion to me, there I am right in the middle of them. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Now, before we move to my questions, I'll call on my colleague and friend Charles to share with us what they might have heard at that time when this verse was written. Charles?
That's not quite what I had anticipated being responding to. However, I'm going to respond to what I thought I was going to be responding to instead of what you asked me to respond to, if that's all right. And
of course.
The really interesting thing, and I wonder whether any of the other, well, actually 3 of you noticed this, the translation that Bill read for us is not what you will have read if you had been looking at the NRSV or most other Bible translations these days. What Bruner has done is to go ahead and to simply translate differently text in 2 places from what most people will have read and most people will be accustomed to seeing. The first instance occurs in verse 15, in which I'm going to read now not the Brunerized version, but the NRSV version, which says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out that fault when the 2 of you are alone. And what Bruner omitted was the little parenthetical phrase, the prepositional phrase, against you. Bruner's text read, if another member of the church sins, go and point out, blah, blah, blah. He used different language, but in effect, he left out that prepositional phrase, against you. And that is one of the more difficult text critical points to deal with, because if you look at the literally couple of thousand texts of the Greek New Testament, you find that there's great division among those witnesses as to whether the phrase "against you" was in the original text or was not. And one of the problems is that there are very strong witnesses in terms of ancient texts that support each of these 2 readings, and it becomes difficult then to figure out. You can't do it just by adding up and saying, well, we've got this reading in 2,582 texts, and we've got this reading in 1,895. So the 2,000 text, it doesn't work that way in text criticism. The rule of thumb in text criticism is lectio brevior polior. The shorter reading is better, and that's because of the way that scribes work when they transcribe things. In any case, the consensus among, I think, most text critics now is that the phrase "against you" was not in the original text. And if you think about the way that this particular phrase, this particular circumstance works out in the whole of the reading that we have, it's not the individual that is the problem here. The problem is how to get the individual who offended back into the community. And that's a community problem, not an individual problem. It might be prompted by an individual, it might be noticed by an individual, but it's a concern for the whole community. And so in that case, Bruner did it the right way, and so Bill, you did right by reading the one which is excluded the text, which the NRSV includes, because it was right. Now the next one is even more subtle. It's in verses 18 and 19. I'll read them just to be able to say them. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind, this is the NRSV I'm reading. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that makes for a nice flow, but that's not the best translation using the perfect tense, which is present in both of these cases. And it is the way that Bruner read it, which is to say, it's not that what the disciples, anybody says that, this is it, and later on their statement gets affirmed by the heavenly host, as it were. It's the other way around. So that the proper way to read it is the way that Bill read it. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Future perfect. And whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed on heaven. So that it clarifies the sequence of the affirmations of a particular action. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Very, very helpful. I might just comment that another reason I preferred Bruner's decision is that if you consider that the only thing you're going to confront is what personally affects you, that to me privatizes it. And the whole point of this is the larger community, I think. Again, thank you, Charles. Well said, well offered. Now, I do have 3 questions, and for the sake of those listening, to give you a sense of where we're going, I'm going to read the 3 questions and then come back and engage myself and my colleagues in a response. Question number 1, how do you understand and how would you describe and characterize the process that Jesus commands us to follow in this passage? What advantages do you see in following this process, and what potential risk are there in this? Number 2, the passage records Jesus' command that when a fellow Christian sins, we are to confront that person. What do you understand sin to mean, and what examples of sin would for you constitute something worthy of your being confronted about, or something you should confront another Christian about? Part of what's behind that question is this works 2 ways. If I'm commanded to challenge someone, then my brothers and sisters are challenged to or asked to confront me. And thanks to technology, my screen jumped 2 or 3 pages. Okay. Question number 3. In what ways does or might Jesus' command in this passage shape and influence worship and education in the church today? So going back to question 1 about how do you understand this, how would you describe and characterize, and what are the pluses and minuses? And Sarah, if I may, I will go to you first.
So how I understand and describe and characterize this process, I think that first and foremost, I really appreciate the fact that Jesus knows that families have friction. And dysfunctional families, the fun part should be the underlying part, not the dysfunction. So that being said, I think whenever you have people working in close proximity to each other, you're going to have a difference of opinion, a difference of perspective, a difference of outcomes that may or may not be in concert with other people. And I think it's really a challenge to sustain a long-term goal for a community if people's perspectives and outcomes aren't aligned. And I think that's part of our task as followers of Christ, is our alignment is to Him and to His model. And just saying that means we now have a difference of opinion. Well, what do you perceive His model to have been, or what do you perceive His model to currently be? And how do we respond to problems that present themselves in our community with that as our alignment measure? So if Jesus is our plumb line, going back to some language that we've encountered before, how do we look at each other and sustain relationship and make the relationship communion the valuable item? And, I loved, there was a conversation, I think it may have been Mark Davis, it might have been Brian Stoppergen. One of their commentaries shared that you wanted not to present a difference of opinion as the thing that would drive the community apart. You didn't want to approach it as if it were your fault and you should sort your stuff out. But you should approach it from a perspective of a doctor telling somebody a diagnosis they don't want to hear. And it'll be hard, and it'll be scary and hurtful. So this idea of how do you sustain a community in love that's rooted in following Christ. I suspect that as soon as the word assembly was used, ecclesia, as soon as that word assembly was used, there was friction. I'm pretty sure about who's important and who's not. I think there was some conversation that between the disciples, who gets to sit on the right, who gets to sit on the left. So there's this conversation or this human trait that we're jockeying for attention, we're jockeying for affirmation, we're jockeying for a leadership role when the conversation is really not about that at all. So that's how I understand, describe, and characterize. If a schism occurs, the goal is to stay in community with that person, staying in conversation with that person. I will confess there have been moments where in my own family it makes more sense to walk away from the conversation and let the temperature cool down so that we can approach the challenge not from a judgmental perspective, but let's examine the challenge we have and figure out a solution together. So what advantages do I see in following this process? I'm grateful that there is this process. I have banged my head on it more than once, let's say it that way. I come from a line of people who, and maybe you have this characteristic in your family, the right till proven wrong perspective. We, being engineers or people who follow the engineering problem-solving process, we have thought it through in our heads, and we are likely to have come to the conclusion that we have arrived at the best of many processes to get to this outcome. And we find it curiously amusing that you have not yet found this process to be the same. And so we tend to follow the right till proven wrong problem-solving skill. So I think that the disadvantages are and the risks of this are just because the way I've approached a problem isn't the best way, hearing it from someone else might be hurtful or startling, to say the least. And so I think it's important, I think about the time that Nathan had to confront David and talk to him about his behavior and what happened with Bathsheba and her husband. And so this conversation about how do you confront somebody in love. So I think that this is a really important passage. I'm just not sure I'm old enough to receive it yet. Long story short.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. In this passage, Jesus says, where two or three are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. My smart aleck side has paraphrased it, where two or three are gathered, there are at least five opinions among them. Sometimes we even argue with ourselves. Okay, Don, thanks, Sarah. Don, your responses.
Lectionary classes at a church where we worship were taught for generations by Bill Wallace. And I was looking back at my notes when he led us in discussion on this passage. And he always emphasized that this anticipates conflict in the church. He thought that was important. And I think he would lead off with that sometimes. This anticipates the conflict. And now I read it as saying, you're not going to, you really shouldn't be in a position where you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe this offense, that this is going to be part of the church on earth. And to me, it now reads as that, therefore, be prepared, listen, and consider the circumstances. It's a way of living. Don't be surprised. Know that this is part of what you're going to be encountering going forward. And Charles, some of the commentators said that's also evidence that this book was was written later, much later, because the church is happening and growing and dealing with these things already. I also see a mutual accountability here, and I think that's what you folks were referring to as well. I read this a lot of the time. I feel the accountability of the one who's offended going in, but there's a mutual accountability. The offender's in this family too, and maybe that person, the offender, is going to recognize what's happening, because it's not like they're coming into the church that day. They've been there all along, and sometimes I forget that when this process begins, they're going to go, oh boy, I know what this is. Or maybe I have taken on as the offended this process. So the ability of them to listen and understand what's going on might be pretty important. The process has an emphasis on this first step one, personal, individual. It's like almost a kind of a condition preceding to step two, and step two may never need to happen. And these characteristics are involved or expected. Matter of fact, if you're leading a class, you might say what characteristics are expected in step one. I wrote down a few: personal, intimate, thoughtful, clear, private, prepared, intentional, and I think really important, contextual. This isn't a new person. This is a part of the family. And vice versa. The offended is a part of the family, and the offender is already a part of the family. If it doesn't start there in step one, that there's an intimacy, that there's context, well, nothing's going to happen. It assumes that there's already a relationship, and that maybe the offender understands what's happening when this confrontation is taking place. It requires reflection and preparation. If you were running a class, moderating a class, if you made a list of those things that you think are required for the offender to go in and have this conversation, the offended to have the conversation, you could also do a little role play with what is the opposite. If it's not personal, it's impersonal. If it's not contextual, you're leaping to conclusions. And it gets really practical at that point. So, Bill, you're asking about the advantages. I have just a short list. One is clarity, because you must pause, you must reflect, you must take some time. The discipline is to get to clarity. One is that it's not about weeding out, and I think that's the trap. You know, you've got somebody who is set apart. What do you do? How do you judge them? That's not what this is all about. It's about restoration of the fabric of the community. And it's about recognizing what is happening by the offender. I have, over the years, forgotten that the offender has been there all along. She is my sister, he is my brother, and I have played the role of offender also in the past. So the discipline is there. We understand what's going on. Now, I can only guess what percentage don't get to stage two, where you have the larger group involved. But I think if you're practiced and you have the Christian discipline, it doesn't go to step two very often at all, because there's a condition preceding, which is you're already we're family, you know each other. To answer your question about what are the risks, I just wrote down a few. Risk number one is not following the process. And the process isn't step one, it's step two. There's like step 1 minus 1, which is you're already in a church, you're already in a family, you're already in a community. You've developed the ability to have this step one. If you haven't developed that ability, you're not followers of the way. You're all failing in the sight of God. It's all a failure if you can't do step one. It should be intimate and patient and contextual. Also, it becomes about exclusion and weeding out. That's one of the downsides. But that's because you haven't done step 1 minus 1. And it isn't about a two-way. It becomes a one-way, where there's a judgment or there's an expectation. I'll get into that, I think, in the answer to question 2, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for conversation. We're doing this in pandemic. If you're Zooming in a class, just ask about what does the Lord require of you before you go in. And I think there will be a nice long list of what's expected, and then the counterpoint about the opposite of what is expected, which is often what happens. So that's my best shot, Bill.
Thank you, Don. You were talking about that Bill Wallace said that, in effect, conflict is inevitable. In my pastoral ministry, at first in premarital counseling, I would say to the couple, do you ever have conflict? I quickly learned to change it slightly. When you have conflict, let me be a fly on the wall and listen as you describe how you handle that. And I was impressed how often people were really honest about that and how it would lead to some very helpful conversations. But I learned to quit asking, do you have conflict when you have it? Quickly, under describe, I put proactive. I know that's a more modern term, but I like that. I'm not just sitting on my hurt feelings or whatever it is. I take initiative. It's courageous. And another way to say that is countercultural. The culture, I think, basically teaches us to stew in our resentment and let it build up. It is risky, but it is an invitation to clear the air. Sometimes that needs to happen, and that itself can be healing, is to clear the air. The advantage I have discovered, it offers the possibility of clarifying what happened. It's interesting to me, being on both sides of this, how often my perception of what happened can be modified. Okay? At least there's the possibility to gain some understanding. The risk, alienation, appearing or becoming self-righteous, especially step 3. You know, if they don't listen to the church in the New Revised Standard Version, let them be a Gentile or tax collector. Bruner says a pagan or a tax collector. Now, I would encourage you, if you haven't, to listen to our friends on Followers of the Way. Deal with this issue. Do we really excommunicate people? And they very effectively remind us that this passage is, in Will Wellman's language, a sandwich between the, let me go back and see my own, hang on a second, bear with me. Who is the greatest, the child, the lost sheep? And then it follows by forgiveness. So I liked Will's imagery there that it's literally a sandwich about stories that talk about not losing someone and being forgiving. And I think we can leave it there. There's a tension between confronting and forgiving. Okay, question number 2. The passage records Jesus' command that when a fellow Christian sins, we are to confront that person. What do you understand sin to mean? And then the examples of what for you would be something worthy of being confronted about or something you should confront another Christian about. And Don, I'll go to you first.
I think sin sticks to people. And I do mean that as a definition. So we have to start with, this is about the community of the church, the fellowship, the people that are together. It has this condition that means that everyone is in relationship and they are pursuing unity. They're assuming collective impact and personal impact, and they know how to have these conversations. So I think within that, sin sticks to people. It keeps folks, it's in a simple way, it keeps folks up at night. It robs people of sleep. It creates avoidance of relationships, evasion. It breaks the ability to have a conversation and solve problems for other people, for your brothers and your sisters. It creates fear, flinching. It creates lasting anger, separation. And sometimes it does those things when the offender may not know it. And I think that's where this beauty of step 1 is, that this is about discovery. This is about self-discovery. And always for me, and you've encouraged this, Bill, me as an offender and how I have been challenged, that maybe I didn't even know things stick to people. Maybe I don't know exactly what I'm doing. I think it can be understated by the offender. Now, I know there are other situations where the offender may be intentionally cruel or judgmental, but also it's underestimated. That's why I keep emphasizing the word context. If you're living with folks, if the arc of your life is with the arc of lives of other people, there is beautiful context where you can tell stories with each other. That's the environment we're talking about here. It's in the church. There may be other kinds of conflict resolutions and challenges outside the church, and there's some nice tools here that can be used. But this is about a place where there are already existing relationships, and you're building on that. In a way, that's the rock that Jesus talks about. And I think it could be as simple as a bad habit. It could be a trauma. I mean, this could be something that it's not just a resolution and a restoration of the fabric, but there could be recovery. There could be addiction. There could be forgetfulness. There could be, I had no idea. And the offender goes, well, I assumed you knew what you were doing. I mean, so I'm not saying there aren't bad intent sometimes that need to be confronted. Lord knows I have them sometimes, but there's a lot more here about uncovering. This is about making even better relationships because, like Bill Wallace said, there's going to be conflict. And conflict is things where you can build things off of. And I think it may include ill intent or hate and distrust, but there are different behaviors for different aspects of these church communities. And I think this step one is a transformative step. And sometimes at the end, we may in the 21st century have called it an intervention. And that the offender has had an intervention for them that's benefited them. And that maybe we are always intervening in each other's life if it's based on love and experience and a sense of our own personal failure and memory of the offender coming to us. And I think that makes for great storytelling. My experience, Sarah, in lectionary classes, sometimes we've been able to talk about that, how we've changed. We were confronted by somebody who knew us, and we knew each other so much better when it was over. I really mean this, that sin sticks in that way is kind of a happy thought when you think about the transformation that takes place in these conversations. And I do believe that step one is 99% of the work, or 99.9% of the work, and there's real joy on that. You go on about your day. And I can remember the kind of happiness in restoration of relationships. It's a good story to tell. That's what I think, Bill.
Excellent. Thanks, Don. Sarah?
So I think that the important thing here is that both parties are teachable or are willing to be taught, willing to be to adjust. You know, I'm thinking back to good diplomacy and what that looks like. And you know, in certain cultures, there are behaviors that you don't use because they were considered offensive. So it could be something as simple as knowing the ground level parameters before having a conversation. It could be in one situation. I think one of the disadvantages of staying close or in friction with someone is you start to recognize what those magic buttons are that are going to make them explode. And I think the intentionality here is not moving toward those, and that it does take not only courage but personal control to not let this just veer off into the ditch, and call the separation, okay, you take your ball and you go home kind of a moment. And I think that the intentionality of looking for ways of reconciliation is something that requires some very extreme personal control. And I agree with you, Dawn. I think that 99% of the work is what you do going in. And on one hand, I often think, is it more courteous to say to somebody, I'd like to have a conversation with you about this? can we talk about it next Tuesday so that there's that preparation opportunity to come to the conversation in a malleable standpoint or in a malleable form, so that it's not, you've offended me, I think you should apologize. That what I call it very strict confrontation that lays out how I've been hurt and then gives you the exact prescription on how you can get yourself out of that hole. And I don't know that I'm ever that good at what I call moving slowly into the conversation. I think there's a discipline and a practice that we could deploy, that we need to deploy. So what does sin mean to me? Anything that would separate me from the community or the community from someone else. And that could be as simple as you weren't prepared for the conversation. It could be as difficult as, it's not okay to do something that's going to hurt another family friend or a vulnerable friend, and be a bully. So I'm thinking about, this is such an interesting, there's parenting implications here, there's sibling relationships that are that work in this, what I call the tension zone or the tidal zone between what works and what doesn't. I think there's implications here of how we work together on a similar enterprise, whether we call it a job or we call it a family or we call it something else. The conversation for some of us is imperative. And if you practice the Nora Hooligan method, which is we don't talk about it, we just do it, it makes it more difficult for those of us that need that language to kind of come to around to that thought. So I think that this is an invitation to consider how we love each other. Because we are all full of sin and fall regularly into the ditch, so to speak. And I think the wonderful part of this is Christ will be there in the conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. And what I'm prepared to share, Sarah, is in a sense going to build on what I heard you saying, that there's a deeper, broader understanding of the concept of sin. I grew up in the Southern Presbyterian Church, and during my childhood, I think it was the Presbyterian Outlook had a deal that if you memorize the child or shorter catechism and did it by somebody who would certify if you got a Bible. Okay, I did it. I got the Bible. And Reverend Harris, a 90-plus-year-old retired minister in the church, was the one who worked with me. And later I realized one of the greatest things he did was model for me that memorization was a part of it, but understanding what you're reading. And so he really helped me. And it's amazing how things stick with you. One of the questions is, what is sin? Sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. Now imagine a 13-year-old saying that. But he helped me understand. I think it's echoing what you said, that the understanding of it is not just, if I lie, that's a sin, or if I hit you, that's a sin. It is. But it's much deeper and broader. Another elder in the church, every time he prayed, he had the phrase, in effect, Lord, make us aware of the sins of commission and omissions. And when he had the chance, he would say, you can sin by doing nothing. That was a helpful thought to me, if you don't defend someone or whatever. So I'm grateful that in my childhood, I was invited, I think, and equipped to see it in a deeper way. Now, I think it was during my generation in seminary in the 60s that someone wrote a book. The title was something like, Whatever Became a Sin? And I think, sadly, it was a precursor of what happened later with what came out about not just one church, but across the board, how poorly church organizations dealt with sexual misconduct by clergy, and instead passed them on to the harm of many people. We remember Bonhoeffer's cheap grace. You know, it was all in the name of, well, we all sin, we're all human, you know, let's not condemn, but helping someone avoid dealing with the consequences of their behavior. And that's cheap grace, I think. Now, speaking of the broader understanding, I'll tell quickly a story that illustrates it for me, because I don't think it has to be necessarily something that we think is a sin. I served a church that fortunately had a great singles ministry because of the leadership, and when they would have an event, there would be scores of people from other churches. And in the pulpit, I did some sermons on divorce and emphasizing that sometimes it doesn't work and we need to be understanding. And with stress, you don't have to be married to be a whole person. I thought I was doing a good job. One point, a couple of members of that singles group called and said, the group has a concern and they delegated us to talk to you. Okay, so they came and very graciously but clearly said, Bill, we appreciate your emphasis, your helping us deal with divorce and you don't have to be married. But what troubles us is that almost without exception, whenever you want to give an illustration of relationship, you use marriage. And they helped me understand, you know, it was one of those things, the moment they said it, I went, you're right. Now, I did go back later and look at a series of sermons. And again, was it a sin that I did that? I don't know that we call that a sin, but it had an impact on people. And so what came out of it, and, you know, the problem with telling these stories, it can sound like I'm making myself look good. The point was that they delegated and had several people come and help me understand the impact of what I was doing. The upshot was I said, I'm going to pay attention to that and I want some feedback. And so they would sometimes smile during a sermon when to talk about relationship, I would use friendship or, you know, a fellow worker or something else. And so it actually was dealt with honestly, but with some humor. And they every now and then I get an email or something, way to go, Bill. Again, it's not that I did it perfectly. It's that it's possible to deal with it at step one. And you referenced Nathan, Sarah. That was a step one. That's what it took, one-on-one. And we remember that Jesus says, or at least it says in Scripture, maybe it's Paul, do not let the sun go down on your anger. That is a powerful directive. And then speak the truth in love. And Jesus said sometimes that this issue of breaking fellowship, again, that's a tough one. But Jesus did say there are times to shake the dust off your feet. He at times called the Pharisees whited sepulchres. And in the conversation which the lectionary jumped over about who is the greatest, and Jesus puts a child in their midst, what does he say? If you violate one of these little ones, harm them, it is better that a great millstone be tied around your neck and you be thrown into the depth of the sea. At least we can say Jesus was not always sweet and nice. He threw people out of the temple and was capable of anger, what we would call righteous anger. There's a lot more could be said, but we'll move on now to question 3. In what ways does or might Jesus' command in this passage shape and influence worship and education in the church today? And I'm going to go first, and then I'll move to my colleagues. I think this models an open, honest, and balanced approach to dealing with conflict, which I think is desperately needed in our nation and world today. A way of recognizing the differences, but dealing with them in a way that builds a community rather than putting us in the many silos that we live in today. And I think it's balanced. I've already said it's sandwiched between the lost sheep and the forgiveness, and yet a willingness to confront. It may have been Bruner. I didn't make a note. One of the commentaries I looked at gave the illustration of the Reformed Church in South Africa that was confronted by other Christian bodies in the world for its defense of apartheid. There was a public example of a Christian or other Christians confronting Christians in South Africa who were defending apartheid. And also, I know that Palmacia Presbyterian Church has joined an organization called Hope. The counterpart in Douglas County is FAST. This interfaith, nonpartisan group of people who work for systemic change. They identify certain issues, right now, criminal justice, mental health, and we seek, based on our faith, to work for real change, not just to and I was caught, I believe it was this past week, the demonstration in Washington, and Al Sharpton spoke, Reverend Al Sharpton, and he has in there a quote, I didn't get it all, but demonstration without legislation basically changes nothing. That was an interesting thought, and I thought that's why I'm involved in FAST and why I'm glad that Palmacia is involved in Hope, because we work for actual change, not just complaining, but working for real change. So I think that the church has an opportunity to model and promote this way of dealing with the conflicts that we have. Sarah, let me go back to you.
So I often find comfort or direction by looking at nature and seeing something that resonates from Scripture in that. This week we had an example of what I call chaos and crisis as we watched Laura go ashore. And I grew up in that hurricane zone that lies between Port Arthur, or I should say further south, Corpus Christi, all the way to Tallahassee or even to Tampa. I've grown up in that region, and so I have a learned posture, behavior, and sequence of events that occur whenever I'm preparing for a hurricane to come ashore. That being said, I don't think it prepares you for the first time you go through what I call change by drastic upheaval. So there's the what happens after the bomb goes off moment. And I think that there's something that has to do with how you love each other after that grows into your soul when you grow up into this part of the world. But there's a different kind of change that occurs by the slow dripping or lapping of water, where erosion shapes or breaks rocks over time because of its persistence. Now, a couple of examples of that I see small seeds that take root that break rocks in half after 100 years. I've seen pearls that emerge from oysters after initially becoming an irritant or something that caused that oyster pain, and the oyster slowly changed that particular problem over time and produces a pearl. So I'm looking from both of those perspectives of we live in a world where chaos and crisis bring change suddenly. And we also live in a world where erosion brings change slowly. And I think we have to find a model that works to the benefit of the community. And I think Jesus gives us that model when we are prepared to sit down and go, this particular situation makes me have concerns. And I'm concerned because of this, this, and this. What are your thoughts? And I agree with you. I think it's a change of perception when you have a conversation. It's a change of problem solving when you have a conversation. But it's all based on having the approach and the careful preparation to sit down and be confrontational in a non-judgmental way. Like, I feel like we have a problem and I'm not sure how to solve it. Can you help? Kind of a way. So I think that this shapes how we love each other as a family, how we are called to love others as a family. And by that I mean anybody that doesn't currently sleep in the house where you work or the house where you worship or the home where you live. So others don't mean people who are wrong or frightening. Others just mean people you haven't yet figured out how to have a conversation with. So I think that that's part of what we're called as a church to do.
Thank you, Sarah. Don?
Thank you. And we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I'm just going to clip through just a few points. And Charles, heads up if you want to do a follow-up as we move towards wrap-up. I just wrote down 5 notes in response to your question. Number 1, friendship is the platform to do this. Without this, step 1, step 2, step 3 don't work at all. Friendship is the platform. The second is seek and destroy mentality is cut back. That's the tendency sometimes, seek and destroy, or how do you minimize threat reduction? This eliminates all that because it's built on friendship. The third, the offender, my take on it, the offender is everybody. Start there. The offender is everybody, not the outlier, not the bad person, not the outsider. Within the church, this person is in our family, and we are all the offender. Next, the confronter is also everybody. It's a part of the Christian discipline, but only if you see yourself as the offender. And then finally, this holds up the power of each relationship, the potential of each relationship. And each relationship is alive, subject to harm, and can be subject to lost trust, but each is capable at any time of changing and growing and being filled with empathy. So those would be my takeaways, with a final note that, isn't it interesting how, in my experience, little we focus on this. I don't remember many sermons on this, even though the lectionary, thankfully, forces us every 3 years to look at it. This isn't something that's carried through my notes at all. Bill Hull, are we good to go to Charles as we wrap up?
We are. Just one quick point I meant to make earlier. Matthew is the only one of the Gospels that records this. Now, what that means, I don't know. But anyway, thank you for your...
It gives us all a great excuse not to talk about it even more. But I just wanted to highlight the joy of this and the affirmation of friendship and restoration, and that we are all the offender. Charles, we've got about a minute or two. Anything for the good of the order? What do you think?
No, because what I was going to say was going to undermine the good of the order. So I'm going to keep it to myself. Thank you.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay.
Well, I will add, I think Matthew was the tax collector.
Oh, beautiful.
And that maybe he was the recipient of this, or a person who confronted it says, why do you always treat me like I'm the tax collector? So I think there's some beauty in that.
Amen. Well, for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening, watching during the time of pandemic, you're subject to some lockdown or quarantine, we commend that site to you. There are other discussions of this passage. The church is on Lectionary. There's wonderful music, different kinds of worship services, reflection, images. So we commend that to you as an additional resource. And you're always welcome. And we'll see you next time.